Happy Thursday. I'm coming to you from my living room again. Um, so I'm going to read another chapter of Matilda today. It's definitely a good day to curl up with a good book. So I'm happy to share the next chapter with you all, where last we left off, Matilda revealed her powers to Miss Honey. So today we're going to learn more about Miss Honey, and the chapter is called Miss Honey's Cottage. So here we go. A little longer chapter. Okay, here we go. Miss Honey joined Matilda outside the school gates, and the two of them walked in silence through the village high street. They passed the green grocer with the window full of apples and oranges, and up the butcher with the bloody lumps of meat on display and naked chickens hanging up, and small bank, and the grocery store and the electrical shop. And then they came out on the other side of the village onto a narrow country road where there were no people anymore and very few motor cars. And now that they were alone, Matilda all of a sudden became widely animated. It seemed as though the valve had burst inside her and a great gush of energy was being released. She trotted beside Miss Honey with little hops, and her fingers flew as if they would be scattered. She would scatter them from 4 windows, and her words went off like fireworks with terrific speed. It was Miss Honey this, and Miss Honey that, and Miss Honey I do honestly feel I could have almost anything in the world, not just I could move almost anything in the world, not just tipping over glasses and little things like that. I feel I could topple tables and chairs, Miss Honey, even when people are sitting in the chairs. I think I could push them over, and bigger things too, much bigger things than the chairs and the tables. I only have to take a moment to get my eyes strong. And then I could push it out in this strongness at anything at all, as long as I am staring at it hard enough. I have to stare very hard, Miss Honey, very, very hard. Then I can feel it all happening behind my eyes. My eyes get hot, just as though they were burning, but I don't mind that it's in the least, Miss Honey. Calm yourself down, child. Calm yourself down, Miss Honey said. Let us not get ourselves too worked up so early in this proceedings. But you do think it is interesting, don't you, Miss Honey? Oh, it is interesting, all right, Miss Honey said. It is more than interesting, but we must tread very carefully from now on, Matilda. Why must we tread carefully, Miss Honey? Because we are playing with mysterious force, my child, and we know nothing about. I do not think they are evil. They may be good. They may even be divine. But whether they are or not, let us handle them carefully. These were wise words from a wise old bird, but Matilda was too steamed up to see it that way. I don't see why we have to be so careful, she said, still hopping about. I'm trying to explain to you, Miss Honey said patiently, that we are dealing with an unknown. It is an unexplainable thing, and the right word for it is a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon. Am I a phenomenon? Matilda asked. It is quite possible that you are, Miss Honey said, but I'd rather you didn't think about yourself as in anything in particular at that moment. What I thought we might do is explore the phenomenon a little further, just the two of us together, by making sure we take things very carefully all the time. You want me to do some more of it then, Miss Honey? There's a picture of Matilda and Miss Honey walking in the woods. That is what I am tempted to suggest, Miss Honey said cautiously. Goody good, Matilda said. I myself, Miss Honey said, am probably far more bowled over by what you did than you are, and I am trying to find some reasonable explanation. Such as what? Matilda asked. Such as whether or not it's got something to do with the fact that you are quite exceptionally precious. What exactly does that word mean? Matilda said. A precious child? Precocious child, Miss Honey said, is one that shows amazing intelligence early on. You are an unbelievably precocious child. Am I really? Matilda asked. Of course you are. You must be aware of that. Look at your reading. Look at your mathematics. I suppose you're right, Matilda said. Miss Honey marveled at the child's lack of conceit and self-consciousness. I can't help wondering, she said, whether this sudden ability is to come to you of being able to move objects without touching it, whether it might not have something to do with your brain power. You mean there might not be room in my head for all those brains, so something has to push out? That's not quite what I mean, Miss Honey said, smiling. But whatever happens, I say it again, it must tread carefully from now on. I have not forgotten that strange, distant glimmer on your face after you tipped over the last glass. Do you think it could actually hurt me? Is that what you're thinking, Miss Honey? It made you feel pretty peculiar, didn't it? It made me feel lovely, Matilda said. For a moment or two I was flying past the stars on a silver wings. I told you that. And I shall tell you something else, Miss Honey. It was the easiest the second time, much easier. I think it's like anything else. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. Miss Honey was walking slowly so that the small child could keep up with her without trotting too fast. It was very peaceful out there on the narrow road now that the village was behind them. It was one of those golden autumn afternoons, and there were blackberries and splashes of old man's beard in the hedges, and the hawthorn berries were ripening scarlet for the birds when the cold winter came along. There were tall trees here and there, so either side, oak and sycamore and ash, occasionally the sweet chestnut. Miss Honey, wishing to change the subject of the moment, gave the names of all these to Matilda, and taught her how to recognize them by the shape of their leaves and the pattern of the bark of their trunks. Matilda took all this in and stored the knowledge away carefully in her mind. They came finally to the gap of the hedge on the left-hand side of the road, where there was 5 barrier gates. This way, Matilda said. She opened the gate and led Matilda through the closed it again. They now walking along a narrow lane with no more than a ratted cart track. There in the high hedge of the hazel on either side you could see clusters of ripe brown nuts in their green jackets. The squirrels would be collecting them all very soon. Miss Honey said that the storing them were away carefully by blinking mouths ahead. You mean you live down here? Matilda asked. I do, Miss Honey replied. She said no more. Matilda had never once stopped to think about where Miss Honey might be living. She always regarded her purely as a teacher, a person who turned up out of nowhere and taught at school and then went away again. Do any of us children, she wondered, ever stop to ask ourselves where our teachers go when school is over for the day? Do we wonder if they live alone, or if there is a mother at home, or a sister, or a husband? Do they live all by them? Do you live all by yourself, Miss Honey? She asked. Yes, Miss Honey said. Very much so. They were walking over the deep sun-baked mud tracks of the lane, and you had to watch where you put your feet if you didn't want to twist your ankle. There were a few small birds around in the hazel branches, but that was all. It was just a farm laborer's cottage, Miss Honey said. You mustn't expect too much of it. We're nearly there. They came to a small green gate, half buried in the hedge, and to the right, almost hidden by the oversized hazel branches. Miss Honey paused with one hand on the gate and said, There it is. That's where I live. Matilda saw a narrow dirt path leading to a tiny, and so here's a picture of them walking in the woods on their way to Miss Honey's house. Red brick cottage. The cottage was so small it looked more like a doll's house than a human dwelling. The bricks in the bullet were old and crumbly and very pale red. It was a gray slate roof with one small chimney. There were 2 little windows at the front. Each window was no longer than a sheet of tabloid newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. On either side of the path was a windowless nettles and blackberry thorns. Long brown grass and enormous oak trees stood overshadowing the cottage. Its massive spreading branches seemed to enfolding them and embracing the tiny building behind the hiding. It is as well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate, which she had not yet opened, turned to Matilda and said, A poet called Dylan Thomas once wrote some lines that I think are very time I will walk this path. Matilda waited, and Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful slow voice, began reciting the poem. Never and never, my girl, riding far near of the land of the heart, hath stone tails and spelled asleep, fear or believe that the wolf is asleep, White Hood. Loping and bleeding, roughly and blitherly shall leap, my dear, out of the lair of flacked leaves in dew-dipped year, to eat your heart in the house is a rosy wood. There was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was proudly moved. "It's like music," she whispered. And there is a picture of Miss Honey's cottage. See the little house right there. "It is music," Miss Honey said, and then through the embarrassment of having revealed such a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate, walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic, and so totally away from this earth. It was like an illusion in a Grimm and Hans Andersen. That means fairy tale, by the way. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel, and where Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived, and it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears and all the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed up the path. In the front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although it was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through the kitchen to help me make the tea," Miss Honey said. She led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That is, if you could call it a kitchen. It was not much bigger than a good-sized clothes cupboard, and there was one small window in the back wall with a sink under the window, and there was no taps over the sink. Against another wall there was a shelf, presumably for preparing food, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself there stood Primus stove, a saucepan, half-full bottle of milk, a Primus of little campaign stove, and filled with a paraffin, and you light it at the top. Then you pump it to get pressure for the flame. "You can get some water while I light the Primus," Miss Honey said. The well is out at the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket to one end." So there they are in the kitchen at Miss Honey's house. They have to heat up the stove with like a little air pusher thing. I'll post a picture. Of the rope, lower it down, but don't fall in yourself. Matilda, more bemused than ever now, took the bucket and carried it out to the back garden. Then the well had a little wooden roof over it and simple winding device where the rope dangling down into the dark bottomless hole. Matilda pulled the rope and hooked the handle of the bucket to the end of it, then lowered it until she heard a splash and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. "Is this enough?" she asked, carrying it in. "Just about," Miss Honey said. "I don't suppose you've ever done that before." "Never," Matilda said. "It was fun. How do you get enough water for your bath?" "I don't take a bath," Miss Honey said. "I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water, and I heat it in this little stove, and I strip and wash myself all over." "Do you honestly do that?" Matilda asked. "Of course I do," Miss Honey said. "Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not so very long ago. And they didn't have a Primus. They had to heat the water over a fire in a hearth." "Are you poor, Miss Honey?" "Yes," Miss Honey said. "Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it?" Primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then from a plastic container she took some margarine and spread it on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. That really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray on it and put 2 mugs in the teapot, half bottle of milk, and a plate with 2 slices of bread. And I'm afraid I don't have any sugar, she said. I never use it. That's all right, Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything embarrass her companion. Oh, and here's a picture of Matilda using the well to get water. Let's have it in the sitting room, Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading it out of the kitchen down the dark little tunnel into the room in the front. Matilda followed her, but just inside the doorway of the so-called sitting room, she stopped and stared around in absolute amazement. The room was small and square and bare as a prison cell. The pale daylight that entered came from a single tiny window in the front wall, and there were no curtains. There were only objects in the entire room. Were two unturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs, a third box between them for a table. That was all. There was no pictures on the wall, no carpet on the floor, only rough, unpolished wooden planks, and there were gaps between the planks where dust and bits of grime had gathered. The ceiling was so low that with a jump Matilda could nearly touch it with her fingertips. The walls were white, but whiteness didn't look like print. Matilda rubbed her palm against it, and white powder came off of her skin. It was whitewash and cheap stuff that used for cow sheds and stables and hen houses. Matilda was appalled that this really where her neat and trimly dressed schoolteacher lived. Was this all she had to come back to after a day's work? It was unbelievable. And what was the reason for it? There was something very strange going around here, surely. Miss Honey put a tray on one of the upturned boxes. Sit down, my dear, sit down, she said, and we'll have a nice hot cup of tea. Help yourself. To bread. Both slices for you. I never eat anything when I get home. I have a good old tuck in at school lunch, and it keeps me going until the next morning. Matilda perched herself carefully on the upturned box, and more out of politeness than anything else, she took a slice of bread and margarine and started to eat it. At home, she would have been having buttered toast and strawberry jam, probably a piece of sponge cake to round it off. And yet this was somehow far more fun. There was a mystery here in this house, a great mystery, and there was no doubt about that. Matilda was longing to find out what it was. So there's Matilda in Miss Honey's living room, where she doesn't have any furniture, just some crates. Miss Honey poured a tea and added a little milk to both cups. She appeared to be not in the least ill at ease, sitting in the upturned box in a bare room and drinking tea out of a mug that she had balanced on her knee. You know, she said, I've been thinking very hard about what you did with that glass. It is a great power you have been given, my child. You know that. Yes, Miss Honey, I do, she said, chewing her bread and margarine. So far as I know, Miss Honey went on, nobody else in the history of the world had been able to compel an object to move without touching it or blowing on it or using the outside to help it at all. Matilda nodded and said nothing. The fascinating thing, Miss Honey said, would be to find out the real limit to your power of yours, or how you think you can move just about anything there is. But I have doubts about that. I'd love to try something really huge, Matilda said. What about distance? Miss Honey asked. Would you always have to be close to things you were pushing? I simply don't know, Matilda said, but it would be fun to find out. That's the end of the chapter. Tomorrow we'll read Miss Honey's story. All right, I hope you're having a good day. I miss you all. Mwah.